If you are or were in a relationship with an avoidant partner, here are 4 questions you should always ask the avoidant. Avoidant individuals have developed sophisticated psychological defenses that allow them to navigate relationships while maintaining emotional distance. However, there are specific questions that cut through these defenses and expose the contradictions in their attachment system. These questions reveal the gaps between their stated preferences and their actual behavior, forcing them to confront the reality of their emotional needs and fears. Question 1. What are you actually afraid will happen if you let someone love you completely? This question strikes at the heart of avoidance psychology because it forces them to examine the specific fears that drive their emotional distance. Most avoidants operate on vague feelings of discomfort around intimacy without clearly identifying what they believe will happen if they allow themselves to be truly loved. When pressed to articulate their exact fears, they struggle because their avoidance is often based on emotional conditioning rather than rational assessment. The question is particularly difficult because it assumes that being completely loved is something they're actively preventing rather than something they don't. This reframe challenges their narrative that they simply prefer independence and forces them to acknowledge that they might actually be running from something specific. The question implies that their emotional distance is a defense mechanism rather than a genuine preference. When avoidants attempt to answer this question, they often provide surface-level responses like, "I don't want to lose my independence," or "I need my space." However, these answers don't explain why being loved would necessarily eliminate independence or personal space. The question demands they go deeper and examine what they actually believe love will cost them or require from them. Their inability to provide concrete answers reveals that their fears are often irrational or based on childhood conditioning rather than adult reality. They may fear being suffocated, controlled, or abandoned. But when pressed to explain why complete love would necessarily lead to these outcomes, they struggle to provide logical explanations. This struggle reveals that their avoidance is driven by emotional programming rather than rational decision-making. The question also forces them to confront the possibility that their fears might be unfounded or outdated if they can't articulate specific, realistic dangers of being completely loved. They must face the possibility that their emotional distance is protecting them from imaginary threats rather than real ones. This realization can be deeply unsettling for individuals who have built their identity around emotional self-protection. Most tellingly, their discomfort with this question often reveals how much they actually do want to be loved completely. Their inability to answer suggests that they haven't examined their own resistance because doing so might reveal that they're preventing themselves from experiencing something they actually desire. The question exposes the contradiction between their stated preferences and their deeper emotional needs. Question 2. If you don't need emotional connection, why do you stay in relationships at all? This question challenges the fundamental contradiction in avoidant behavior, claiming not to need emotional connection while simultaneously maintaining relationships. If they were truly emotionally independent and didn't require connection, logic would suggest they would be happier alone. The question forces them to examine what they're actually getting from relationships that contradicts their stated preference for independence. The question is particularly powerful because it uses their own logic against them. Avoidants often pride themselves on being rational and practical, so when asked to explain the logical inconsistency in their behavior, they struggle to provide coherent answers. If emotional connection isn't valuable to them, their continued participation in relationships becomes inexplicable from a rational perspective. When pressed to answer, avoidants often provide superficial explanations like companionship, shared activities, or practical benefits. However, these explanations don't explain why they couldn't get these same benefits from friendships or casual relationships without the emotional complications that romantic partnerships inevitably involve. The question reveals that they must be seeking something deeper than they're willing to acknowledge. Their attempts to answer often reveal the covert emotional benefits they derive from relationships while denying their emotional significance. They might mention enjoying having someone to talk to, feeling comfortable with familiar company, or appreciating having someone who cares about them. These admissions contradict their claims of not needing emotional connection and reveal their hidden emotional dependencies. The question also forces them to confront the reality that their presence in relationships affects others emotionally, even if they're not consciously seeking emotional connection themselves. If they truly didn't need or want emotional bonds, the ethical choice would be to avoid relationships altogether rather than creating emotional attachments they don't intend to reciprocate fully. Most importantly, their inability to answer this question coherently reveals that they do need emotional connection but have convinced themselves otherwise. Their continued participation in relationships, despite claiming not to need emotional bonds, suggests that they're either self-deceptive about their needs or dishonest about their motivations. Either way, the question exposes the fundamental contradiction in their self-perception. Question 3. Why do you get upset when someone you claim not to be attached to starts pulling away? This question exposes the disconnect between avoidants' stated emotional detachment and their actual emotional reactions. Most avoidants experience significant distress when partners begin to withdraw, even while claiming these relationships don't mean much to them. The question forces them to explain why they would have emotional reactions to losing something they claim not to value. The question is particularly challenging because it addresses their behavior rather than their stated beliefs. While they can control their verbal expressions of attachment, they can't easily control their emotional reactions to perceived abandonment. Their distress when others pull away reveals their actual emotional investment, despite their claims of detachment. When avoidants try to answer this question, they often minimize their reactions or reframe them as something other than attachment. They might claim they're upset about the inconvenience, the disruption to their routine, or the other person's behavior rather than acknowledging emotional loss. However, these explanations typically don't match the intensity or nature of their actual reactions. Their difficulty answering honestly reveals how much they depend on others' emotional availability while denying this dependency. They often become accustomed to having someone emotionally invested in them and react strongly when this investment is withdrawn, even if they never consciously acknowledge valuing it. The question exposes this hidden emotional dependency. The question also forces them to confront the possibility that their emotional reactions reveal their true feelings more accurately than their conscious thoughts. If they experience genuine distress when others pull away, this suggests they're more attached than they want to admit to themselves. This realization can be threatening to their self-image as emotionally independent. Most tellingly, their inability to explain their reactions without admitting attachment reveals the depth of their self-deception. They often genuinely believe they're not attached while simultaneously experiencing all the emotions associated with attachment. The question forces them to confront this internal contradiction and acknowledge that their emotional reality doesn't match their self-perception. Question 4. What would have to change for you to feel safe being emotionally vulnerable with someone? This question is perhaps the most difficult for avoidants to answer because it assumes that their emotional distance is about safety rather than preference. It forces them to examine what conditions would need to exist for them to feel secure enough to be vulnerable, implying that their avoidance is fear-based rather than simply a lifestyle choice. The question is particularly challenging because it asks them to imagine a scenario where vulnerability feels safe, which requires them to acknowledge that their current emotional distance might be motivated by feeling unsafe rather than simply preferring independence. This reframe threatens their self-image as strong and self-sufficient individuals who choose emotional distance rather than being driven to it by fear. When avoidants attempt to answer this question, they often struggle because they haven't clearly identified what would actually make vulnerability feel safe. They might mention needing guarantees about not being hurt or abandoned, but these guarantees are impossible to provide in real relationships. Their inability to identify realistic conditions for safety reveals that their fear might be about vulnerability itself rather than specific relationship circumstances. Their difficulty answering also reveals how their safety requirements might be impossible to meet in genuine relationships. They might need complete control over emotional outcomes, guarantees about their partner's behavior, or assurance that vulnerability won't lead to dependency. These requirements are incompatible with authentic emotional connection, suggesting that their avoidance might be a way of avoiding the inherent risks of love rather than responding to specific relationship threats. The question forces them to confront whether their emotional distance is actually keeping them safe or simply keeping them isolated. If they can't identify realistic conditions that would make vulnerability feel safe, they must consider whether their avoidance is actually protective or simply preventing them from experiencing the connection they might actually want. Most importantly, their struggle to answer reveals that their emotional distance might be maintained by fear rather than choice. If they could identify specific conditions that would make vulnerability feel safe, they might realize that some of these conditions could actually be met in healthy relationships. Their inability to envision safety and vulnerability suggests that their avoidance might be more about trauma or conditioning than rational decision-making. The deeper meaning of their inability to answer the fact that avoidants struggle with these questions reveals several important truths about their attachment system. Their difficulty answering suggests that their emotional distance is maintained by unconscious defense mechanisms rather than conscious choice. They often haven't examined their own motivations closely because doing so might reveal contradictions in their self-image. Their inability to provide coherent answers also reveals the extent to which their avoidance is driven by emotional conditioning rather than rational assessment. They often operate on automatic emotional responses developed in childhood rather than adult evaluation of current relationship realities. This automatic functioning prevents them from making conscious choices about their emotional availability. The questions also reveal how much energy avoidants invest in maintaining their emotional distance. If their independence were natural and effortless, they would be able to answer these questions easily. Their struggle suggests that their emotional distance requires constant psychological maintenance and self-monitoring that contradicts their image of natural independence. Most significantly, their difficulty with these questions reveals the gap between their conscious self-perception and their unconscious emotional reality. They often genuinely believe they don't need emotional connection while simultaneously experiencing all the emotions associated with attachment. This internal contradiction creates the psychological tension that makes these questions so difficult to answer. Why these questions matter. Understanding why avoidants can't answer these questions provides insight into the nature of their attachment system and the internal conflicts they experience. Their struggle with these questions reveals that their emotional distance might be more about self-protection than genuine preference, suggesting that their avoidance might be changeable with appropriate support and self-awareness. The questions also help explain why relationships with avoidants often feel confusing and contradictory. Their inability to understand their own motivations means they often send mixed signals and behave in ways that contradict their stated preferences. Understanding their internal confusion helps explain their external inconsistency. For partners of avoidance, these questions can provide insight into the unconscious dynamics driving their behavior. Rather than taking their statements about not needing connection at face value, these questions reveal the deeper emotional needs and fears that actually motivate their actions. This understanding can help partners make more informed decisions about their relationships. Most importantly, these questions reveal that avoidant individuals might benefit from exploring their own emotional patterns more deeply. Their inability to answer suggests that they haven't fully examined their own motivations and fears, which prevents them from making conscious choices about their emotional availability. The questions can serve as starting points for deeper self-reflection and potential growth. The struggle with these questions ultimately reveals that avoidant attachment, like all attachment styles, is about finding safety and connection rather than avoiding them. Their emotional distance is a strategy for managing fears about vulnerability and abandonment rather than evidence of not needing emotional bonds. Understanding this can help both avoidants and their partners approach relationships with greater compassion and insight into the unconscious fears that drive apparently contradictory behavior. Yeah,